Shell.
Hello.
There you go. Two guys look magic.
Oh.
Do you want to film your little...
Well, we just got married yesterday, so...
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well done.
What's this for?
Oh, just a...
Olives.
You love olives?
Oh,
Right? That's where
really
they
dig
grow.
olives. So do you do this often? You film olives
Strangers.
Yeah, well,
Strangers
just started.
often.
often? Oh, you just started. New camera?
Yep.
Oh, beautiful. Oh, look at that sunset.
Keep walking, guys. That's it. It's beautiful.
No worries. Nice to meet you.
Yep. All the best. All the best.
Who's liable here? Is it the driver's fault, the organisers, the Brax government?
It's not the Brax government, it's the CAMS matter, and the matter's been handled by CAMS.
And I guess there's no chance then that this fatality will stop next year's race going ahead?
The difference between Canberra Greeks and Perth Greeks and Greek Greeks and...
Well, I don't know a lot about the Canberra Greeks.
Tell me about the Perth Greeks.
I've only met a couple of Canberra Greeks, but Greeks are Greeks. So Perth Greeks, well, the original Perth Greeks came from Horizon. The first Perth Greek came before the turn of the century, and his name was Mr. August. And the story goes that he actually killed a Turk on Horizon, and he ran away and managed to get on a ship that found him here. And so he's thought to be one of the very early Greeks here. And he has a dynasty of people here that, like the August family, that like the Kailises have done very well. Another significant family were the Michaelides. Now, Mr. Michaelides, he came around the turn of the century and started to make cigarettes. He had a little shop and used to cut tobacco, and he actually came from Egypt rather than Greece itself, but his roots were from Castellorizo. And when he got here, of course, there weren't many Greeks, so he married a local girl, and his family then proceeded to expand in the tobacco industry, and to the point where they had several farms actually growing tobacco in the southern part of the state. And his highlight, I suppose, was during the war, when the only cigarettes one could buy were his, and in Western Australia. And of course they would have gone to the military as well, but through a number of reasons he wasn't competitive after the war, when all the other cigarettes started to come in, and he was too late in moving over to the more modern cigarettes he had with the old style non-filter or non-filter tip cigarettes. And so the whole business collapsed, you know. And he actually had quite a number of properties in Northbridge, quite valuable properties. He himself did okay in the end. I mean, he lived a ripe old age, but the family suffered, and he used to employ a lot of relations in the factory, and of course had a big impact on the broader family. But he was a very significant person. So in those very early days, there was only really a handful of Greek people, and they did their best. They were quite energetic and got into various businesses. Restaurants are also very popular, but they weren't Greek restaurants. They were serving lamb and 3 veggies and steak and chips and eggs and tomatoes and all that sort of stuff. They were catering for the needs of the local people. So there was no suggestion of a Greek cuisine. In fact, these people who came into the restaurants didn't have a history of restaurant or food when they got here. It was a case that they were willing to work long hours, and once they got into a bit of a routine, somebody started the business, and then the next relation had come and they'd learn. They'd start off washing dishes and finish up cooking the steaks. Then they might go out and get their own business. But by the 1940s, most Greeks were in some sort of business here. There were a few that weren't, but I'd say the majority were in business. And fruit and vegetables were another big area where there was Greeks. A few went into fish and chip shops, but not as many as in fruit and vegetables. Fish and chips were considered to be sort of lower in the rung. And so if you had a fruit shop, that was pretty good stuff. And those same fruiterers, they then moved on to open up the coffee shops. The restaurant business, only a few actually went into restaurants, and quite a few that were in restaurants actually moved out of restaurants. So I think it was just probably too hard, and the returns weren't very good. In that early stage, a few people started to become educated, the kids, and the Hondras family featured in that area. Now, the Hondrases had a major fruit shop, and out of that family, early in the piece, emerged an engineer, and he finished up as a lecturer at the University of Western Australia, and also a doctor. And there was a couple of other families where there were doctors involved, or doctors produced from that family, and maybe the odd lawyer, but it was very small numbers. Most of the Greek people lived close to the city, close to the church, walking distance to the church. And for a long time we only had one church here, though the population was quite Greek population was quite large, and so that became, you know, the major focus of the Greek community. So within a sort of a triangle of several kilometres, you had basically 80% of the Greek community.
What was that suburb called?
Well, it was basically Perth, East Perth, North Bridge. It was in that general area. So if you drew a radius of about 2 kilometres around the centre of Perth, most people live there. Then a few people started to go out into South Perth, like my family did. And even though the early Greeks here were Castellarians, there was a significant number of Ithacans here as well. It's very small but significant, and they were very friendly with the Castellarians, intermarried, and these Ithacan families still identify themselves with the Castellarian people. And as an example, one of my cousins has married an Ithacan, one of the Kailises, married an Ithacan, and this is fairly common to see that. You know, the numbers were such that there wasn't enough, not enough people to actually intermarry within themselves. The very early Greeks, because of a lack of Greek girls, tend to marry Australian girls, or local girls. Then when there was an influx of Greek people here, and the trend was for them to marry Greek women, with a small percentage still marrying out. But today, I don't have any figures, but I'd say that it'd be lucky if 50% of the Greek diaspora here married Greeks. Quite a few have married Italians. Some of my cousins have married Italians, and and the Italians they've married tend to be from the south, like Calabrians, and of course historically Sicily and Calabria were part of Magna Graecia, which was part of Greece. So maybe the roots are still there that has created the attraction, and it's not to do with the fact that they were Italian as such. And maybe that you know, getting to meet those sort of people stirred up some very ancient feelings in that situation. Yeah, well, once after the Second World War, there was a new influx of Greek migrants, you know, with the schemes that were around that come out for $10 and everything else, and Macedonians, and basically the Kazis, who were the dominant group, didn't really accept them. They considered them to be Xeni, and but you know, there was some marrying into those groups, but of course they were sort of people coming from disparate places. There might have been some from mainland Greece, some from Crete, some from Lesbos, some from Cyprus. So there wasn't a core of people in this new group, and so family identification was not there. There was no way one could identify soy, which was very strong in the Castellarian community.
What's soy again?
Soy is the pecking order, or the standing in the community a family has. That's soy. Just if I retract back a little bit, my grandfather came to Australia in 1904 with his brother. My grandfather's name was Diamantari, and his brother was Basil. And when they arrived here, it was an act of desperation. The island had started to face economic hardships, and the word was that in Australia there was money in the streets. You could just come along and just reap the money and collect it. It was the time of the gold rush, and particularly in the Kalgoorlie area, which is one of the major gold producing areas in the world. And they didn't go to Kalgoorlie, they went to a fairly isolated town called Daydorn, which is near Kew, where there were large mines, and they were successful in setting up their business, serving the mining town. They had a cafe, and they had a bit of a mixed business, and they also sold fish and ice. The ice had to come from Perth by train. The siding where they picked the ice up from was some 5 to 10 kilometres away from the town, and the train would come in at about 3 o'clock in the morning, so they'd have to take their horse and cart and go to the siding and either wait for the train, or the train would be there and they'd collect the ice. Back in about 1910, Basil, who was single, decided to go back to get married. And he went back to the island, and my grandmother was there with my father, who was now about 8 or 9. And after inquiring where her husband, the Iwatari, was, he was still in Australia, she said she wasn't going to stay on the island, she was going to go. So she got on the first boat down to Egypt, and then waited until the boat came along. In the meantime, the uncle had got married on the island as well. The problem was my grandfather, in his mind, had wanted to come to Australia to make the money and then go back to the island, because that's where their home was. And so it took him longer than he thought. So anyway, the family came, and they came on a ship. I've got the records at home what ship it was, I can't remember exactly what the name of it was. And then they went up by train to Daydorn, where again they had a very successful period up there. From all accounts, they enjoyed the stay up there. My father, who was at that time about 9, he had to go back into the first grade to learn English. Didn't speak English, but picked it up pretty quickly. His English was impeccable. When I came onto the scene, he spoke just like any other Australian. He had absolutely no accent at all. So he was basically an Aussie, which was a bit unusual amongst the Greek community. So he showed some aptitude, and because they were dealing with the railways a lot, bringing in the produce, the station master asked my grandfather to let my father come down to Perth to study to be an assistant station master. Because he was good at listening, writing, numbers. But my grandfather said no, and that was the biggest disappointment my father had in all his life. He always used to say how he regretted that his father had not let him do this course and take on a government job, as they say. Anyway, what happened was that just prior to the then time moves on to about 1914, and the war broke out. And when the First World War broke out, all the mines shut because all the men left to go to war. It was an exciting time. also the markets for gold were down. So when the mine shut, the whole town collapsed and they had to come back to Perth. And so that was their first major setback. And then the war broke out, so they were stuck here. So my grandfather's vision of going back to Castellorizzo dissipated. So it looked like they were going to have to stay here. So then the next lot of moves were to make a more permanent base, and they were living in Perth, and they had some little shops, and the last sort of business they had in this period was a fruit cart. They have a cart where they have like a fruit shop which is in the street. And they were talking about 1914, 15, around those times. And most Greek people didn't have fruit shops at that point. They came a bit later. And anyway, they did reasonably well with that. Then the Depression came in, and of course people had no money to buy fruit, so that was their next major setback. And then my grandfather got sick and he died, and so my father, by this time, he was married, had a child, and was the breadwinner, and it was the Depression. Being unskilled, he then went to work in the railways, but as a labourer, and he used to go away for a week and be back for a week. So he used to work every second week, and they'd get some sort of dole. Then there were a couple of Greek people who had done reasonably well. Somehow they'd managed to, they had enough resources and were able to pull through the Depression. And on the week off, my father used to go and work in one of these fruit shops, so he managed to get a bit of extra income, but still not a lot. And then the Depression drifted out. They drifted out of the Depression, and so the railway work also ceased because the railways were a bit more established. And then he took on just working in some fruit shops. Then he was approached, because he's a pretty reliable sort of bloke, he was approached by another Greek fellow who had a semi-reliable brother-in-law, and said to him, "Hey George, how would you like to go into partnership in a fruit shop with my brother-in-law, and I'll finance the whole thing?" He said, you know what's going on, you're pretty reliable. And so then my father went into his own fruit shop with a partner, and that partnership lasted until the fellow died some 10 years later. And then a few years after that, my father then went into the coffee lounge business, of which he was in there until he retired. The other interesting story is that, if we go back a little bit again, my mother was born in 1911, and so she saw the First World War out on the island, and the island was actually, Castellorizzo was attacked by the Germans, and they actually dropped bombs in the harbour, and she was only a little girl. She could have been 3 or 4 years old, and a piece of shrapnel actually hit her leg and just left a scar, just a small scar, but when she's only a little girl. And anyway, my father was over here, and he was about 30, and my mother's uncle had actually come to, one of her uncles had come to live in Perth, and because the community was small, her uncle, who knew my grandfather, said to my grandfather, "Hey, Matari, what's George up to? He's 30 and he's not married." He said, "He's gonna, you got anything in mind?" He said, "Oh no, we haven't." He said, "Oh," he said, "my sister's got a nice girl in Castellorizo." Anyway, my grandfather, and they were from Soy, okay, so they knew the family. My grandfather knew my other grandfather from Castellorizo, and the old people other than him. So that's some of the early history.
So that last section, as I switched the camera, I must have switched it off. So tell me about your grandmother.
Oh, about the.
She's more like Goddess Athena, wasn't she?
Yeah, she was like that. She was 6 foot tall too, my grandmother.
6 foot.
She was tall. And my grandfather was like about my size. I never met him, but he was only a short bloke. And and she was 40 when she got married.
40.
Yeah, got married late in life. And I think that's why they only had one son. And of course then there was this gap of about 7 years when they would have had maybe another couple of kids, and they didn't. So anyway, my grandmother was very protective of my mother because it was her niffy. And when my other grandmother came, they were a bit more interested in having sort of infighting within the family, and my grandmother became very protective of my mother and wouldn't let her go and see her mother, because my mother's mother would stir her all up and upset her and everything. So my grandmother took on a more protective role, and my grandmother's name was Costanina, and in those early days everybody knew my grandmother. She didn't know very much English, but she was very interesting because she used to go out and visit all her friends. Now, we lived in South Perth, and the only way you could get to Perth was by tram, and my father had his shop in the city, so she knew how to get from our house, which used to live with us, to his shop. And then my father then would put her on the right tram, because they were like a bit of a terminus where the shop was, and she'd go to see her friends. And so once she got into an area, she'd drop into person A and then have a cup of tea and everything, and then they'd both move off to person B and person C, and she'd entertain herself during the day by visiting all her friends. So and occasionally my grandmother got lost. She caught the tram in the opposite direction, and there are many times we had to go out and look for her, though she was safe. There's nothing, nothing had happened to her. But as an example, she'd gone out to north of Perth, and she was sort of a little bit dark, and my father was waiting for her at the shop, and she caught the tram in the opposite direction. And there were no telephones, so you couldn't ring up and say, is Costanina there, she left or anything, so you just have to sit and wait. And then it'd be often like 9 o'clock at night, you see a tram coming up one of the streets in the city, and there'd be one person sitting in the tram, because you could actually see through the tram. It'd be my grandmother, and because she always used to wear black and she was 6 foot tall, she stood out. And we look at the trams as they're coming along, then we see one, because when they were coming back towards the city about 9 o'clock, they were generally empty, and then we'd say, there's Grandma, she's arrived. Okay, then we'd all hop in another tram and go home.
So she had a big influence on the family?
Had a big influence on me, and in fact I was closer to my grandmother than my mother. My mother had all her own problems, and whereas my grandmother had the time to look after me, and I was 9 when she died, so she was around in my formative years, and we had a lot of fun. Interesting things. my grandmother was she was very enterprising, and I think this is probably why I'm a bit like that, you know. Far more enterprising than my mother. My mother was very much a person who wanted us to be educated. I'm sure my grandmother did too, but she had an uncle who was a professor at the University of Athens, and she had this in her mind that her sons were going to be, you know, professors, and so she achieved that objective. I mean, we achieved it for her, but you know, I mean, things were hard, and we had a hard, very strict upbringing. You know, might have gone off the rails at some stage and got married and gone into a shop, you know, rather than being where I am now. So,
So what else
now,
did
like,
your grandmother give you?
yeah, well, a typical, well, let me just explain a couple of things. A typical day in my grandmother's life would be she'd always get up at sort of like 4 o'clock in the morning. And in those days, it was sort of wartime, so you know, electricity wasn't abundant. So she used to get up about 4 and sort of crack at dawn, basically, because the dawn's pretty early here. And she'd chop the wood for the wood stove. And now at this stage, she was sort of in her 70s, late 70s. She's about the same age as my mother-in-law. And she'd light the fire in the kitchen because it was wartime and there wasn't a lot of gas and all that sort of stuff. And she'd light the copper in the laundry, and that so that then by the time I got up, she'd have made the breakfast, toast and everything else. And on weekends, she'd cook us, you know, like these Lebanese bread, those, but Greek style. They used to have those because they'd probably learnt them in Castellosa from the Turks and that, you know, that sort of unleavened bread. And she'd make those, and they'd make them on top of the stove, and they'd be piping hot. You know, you'd wake up and you get this aroma of this stuff. Or she'd make scones, and or she'd make what we call lucumades, or which are like a donut. You know, they throw this flour and mixture into water, into boiling oil, and it puffs up, you know, like a donut. And then they put honey on it and that sort of stuff. There's always this sort of stuff on a weekend, you know, never miss. And she also used to cook us eggs on top of the stove. You know, the old wood stoves, they had like hot plates, and where you go to pick a hot plate up to lift it out so you can see inside the stove, there was an indent about that big, and you'd sit an egg into those. There were 3 of them, and these eggs would cook, and they'd have a different flavour. You know, they'd be they wouldn't have that sort of boiled egg flavour. They actually, you know, it's a bit like boiling meat versus cooking steak on a barbecue. You know, that it's the same meat, but just you got a different flavour coming out of the eggs. So she'd do us eggs like that, and then she was great at manufacturing things. Like because my father had the fruit shop, every year we'd make the tomato paste, and he'd bring home something like 10 cases of tomatoes, very ripe tomatoes, and we had this large tub, and when the season was on, we'd get all these tomatoes, we'd wash them, and he made a frame for us that'd sit over this tub with fly wire, and then we'd sit there just scraping the tomatoes on the fly wire, and all the juices would go under, and all the seeds would stay on top of the fly wire, and all those seeds we'd throw into the garden, and all these tomatoes would be coming up that we'd be eating. You know, that was because they were non-hybrid tomatoes, so you actually got tomatoes from them. And then we'd put like a tool material over this tub and leave it out in the sun, and all the pulp would rise to the top, and you're left with just the water underneath. And we'd scoop all that off, we'd mix that in with salt, and then we pack it into jars, and that was the tomato paste for the year. Okay. Then we had a quince tree. So another job we had to do was to do the liqueur, the sweet with the quinces. So the quince time would come along. We'd peel the quinces, cut them up into pieces that were the right size. So when you serve it up on a little plate, it would be the right size. So we'd carefully cut all that up, and I was helping, you see. And then we'd get the sugar and make the syrup, and then we'd boil it up, and we'd do it until the quince didn't collapse, but it was clear, absolutely clear. You can look through it, right? Perfect. And then we'd take that and we'd pack that into jars, and we had like a pantry, and all this stuff would be in the pantry, Then my father, because he liked fruit, he actually had fruit trees in the back of his garden, and he brought in a Seville orange. Now, the Seville orange is a bitter orange for the Greek sweets, and so it has a big thick peel. Very little fruit. You don't eat the fruit, just have the peel. And and what we'd do is we'd wait for the oranges to ripen. We'd go and collect the oranges, and then we'd peel those, but we had to do them in like that, and out of one orange we might get 10 pieces, and we have to prepare the liqueur from that. What we do then is we get a needle and thread, and we'd curl them so they were like a little roll, and then you put a cotton through them, and then you had all these strings of orange peel, and then same deal, you'd make up the syrup, you put them in, you boil them up, and then again this orange would be like glacé fruit, but beautiful, soft to eat, not mushy, and because the Seville orange is bitter, you have this bitter sweet taste, beautiful. So that was another thing we'd manufacture. Now my grandmother, and there were many sort of, figs were another thing. We'd go and collect the figs off the fig tree when they're green, little green ones, and you make the sweet green figs for the liqueur, because the tradition in the Kazi home was that if you had a visitor and they came, you'd put them in the lounge room. You'd never put them in the kitchen or anything like that. They have to go into the lounge room, even if they were your brother or sister. You had to dimisi them, as they say. Dimi means you had to respect them. Okay, so you put them in the best room of the house, and within 1 microsecond of them sitting, there'd be no sort of sitting around. Oh well, we better decide to have a cup of tea. The first thing that happened would be a glass of cold water and a liqueur. So the liqueur was a very important thing. You had to have it there. You didn't have to say, oh, what's in the fridge? What have we got? You knew you had it, And another thing we used to have was cherries. We'd do cherries, the same thing. And we had half a dozen of these. And coconut was another thing. We'd prepare coconut, get fresh coconut, scrape it, because the coconut used to come in, was rancid. My father had fresh coconuts in the shop. And again, you'd make the syrup and you'd have the coconut, and so it was delicious, diabetes stuff, but very delicious stuff. And I think that was because people from Castellorizo, would have to walk to the next house or something. It was hot, glass of water, maybe, and also sugar was considered to be a luxury on Castellorizo, and so it showed that you were giving them the best you could give them, right? Now the other thing is, my grandmother in her manufacturing, she had a stick, my grandmother's stick. Okay, I'm writing a book about all this because I think it's good stories. And this stick was about 3/4 of a broomstick, very smooth, and it was burnt at one end. And the reason it was burnt was that her stick, she used to use it as like a bit of a walking stick. She had a little bit of a limp, when she was stoking the fires, she'd use the stick to push the wood around, you know. Then it was very clean, even though it was charcoaly at one end. Didn't give off any black stuff. She used to use that for doing all the Greek pastries, like if she was rolling out, for baklava, or a favourite dish from Castellorizo is called a stravot, which is like a baklava, but it's a bit more crisp, and so it's all layered and with almonds and all that sort of stuff in it. When she was making the scone, she'd roll out the pastry with a stick. She used to make her own spaghetti, like a tagliatelle, and I'd help her do this, make up the brew, and then she'd roll it all out, and then she used to get a stick and use it like a ruler, and she'd cut these strips, and she'd let them sort of semi-dry on the table, and then she'd get 2 chairs, and she'd put the stick across the chairs, then she'd hang the tagliatelle over the stick, and then leave it out in the sun. This is true, and it would dry out, and then we go and collect it and put it into containers. Another dish she used to make was like not a ravioli, but let's say it's a bit like ravioli. She'd make this pastry and she'd cut it. Instead of making the tagliatelle, which was strips, she'd then cut it up into small pieces, like little noodles, and she'd fry those in onion and olive oil to give them a bit of flavour, and then she'd make soup out of them, put those into the soup, and put in vegetables. That was beautiful. You'd have, so these were like, they tasted a bit like ravioli, but they didn't have anything in them, but they were actually in the soup, and they didn't fall apart. I mean, it was good food, And another dish she used to make, and we absolutely loved it, all the old bread. We'd cut it up into pieces like in the church, like the andidero, and so we'd keep all that bread, the old bread, wouldn't throw it out. Then when there was enough, you'd then cut it up into pieces, and you'd make it like a little loaf, stack it up on a plate so it looked like a loaf, and then you get boiling hot water and you pour over the bread, just enough to soak into the bread but not to make it sloppy. Then we'd grate cheese over that, and then we get butter and burn it on the thing and pour the butter over it, and that was the meal. And I tell you what, that's one of the most delicious meals you could ever have. It's so simple.
You cook it now?
Oh, it's too cholesterol-y. But I do crave for it. And another thing she used to make, which is very delicious if you want to make something very quickly, she'd get tomatoes and onions and cut them up into small pieces, and so maybe 1 onion and a couple of tomatoes for a small white onion and a couple of tomatoes for just a single person, and then put olive oil on that in a plate like a little salad, and then grate say a hard cheese, so it's not quite a Greek salad, but like say Roman cheese or Parmesano cheese, and then just sit down and eat that with lots of bread. And I mean, that's it's a great meal. I mean, who's going to be there in the kitchen cooking? Within 2 minutes you're eating. So these are all things that I can remember from my grandmother, and also my father planted 3 olive trees at home, and my grandmother and myself would go and pick the olives. We'd crack the olives, we'd slit the olives, do all the olives, make all the olives, and we pack those up in jars. We have all the olives for the year. We never bought any olives. We just produced all our own. And when the last lot of olives turned black, she had this big like a vase. It was like I used to call it Aladdin's lamp, You know, it looked like one of those Aladdin's type vases in Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, all that sort of stuff. Anyway, she used to put the olives in here with the salt, just put salt in them in the dark. And I can always remember her arm was lily white, you know, never seen the sun. She wore black right to here. The only thing that was exposed was her face and her hands. And she'd lift her arm up, thing up, and she'd stir this thing up, you know, and then she'd pull out a handful of olives and that, put them on a plate, wash them, bring them into the kitchen, put the olive oil on them, and put them on the table. And you know, I can remember that, you know, from when I was a little kid, you know, with the olives. So my experience with olives is mainly in table olives, not so much in olive oil. We used to buy olive oil. So that's the that's the olive component. And talking about olive oil, because my grandmother had no teeth, the doctor was able to, and she had no dentures, didn't want any. The doctor was able to write her a prescription for olive oil. And so during the wartime, we'd go to the chemist with a prescription and get the bottle of olive oil. And then, because of that, we had olive oil at home to cook the fish and everything else. So, because you know, during the war, the only way you get olive oil is if you knew an old Italian who may have had a simple little crusher to produce the produce the olive oil. So
what else did you get from your grandmother?
What else? Patience. That's what I got from my grandmother. Because all this time, all this work. Now this was an old olive grove here. You interested in this?
Yeah.
Where is it? Oh, we passed it. I think we might have passed it. Do you want to go back? Hey?
Well, yeah, if you...
It's probably not worth it. We're going to see more. Yeah. If we come back this way and it's not dark, we'll stop. Yeah, because all this stuff, you know, it was a time when we didn't have a phone, we didn't have a car. To do anything, it took time. You had to wait because what happened was that I went to school at 6, so once I was compass, say at about 3, from 3 years old to 6 years old, I used to get lugged around with my mother and my grandmother, visiting, and often it'd be during the week, and there were no kids there. I'd have to make my own fun. So I learned to be patient, you know, and that's a good virtue to have. A good virtue to have. Whereas I know, but I do get impatient when people are not being serious. You know, if you know what I mean. I mean, I don't mind that, but I'm talking about a different sort of patience. I'm talking about a situation where it doesn't worry me if I've got to, you know, wait around for somebody to pick them up, or, you know, and others say, oh, come on, let's go and do it quickly and everything. It doesn't worry me. I can be. So I'd say that's one of the things that my grandmother taught me. Obviously, a lot of skills that I remember, and all those things that we did, I can do. And in fact, I'm going to write this book with all these. It's called My Grandmother and Me. And what I'm going to do is actually go back and redo them myself, and so I can have a bit more detail. So for instance, with the tomato paste, I'll know how much paste is produced from a case of tomatoes, which I can't remember exactly now. I know it was a lot, but and all that sort of stuff. So I'll have more quantities. And just recently, there's an olive magazine called the Olive Grower, and I happened to be telling somebody about, the Greek gandili.
Yeah.
Where they have the olive oil and the bit of water and olive oil. And I was telling somebody about that, and they said, "Oh, can you write us a story about that?" And I said, "Yeah, because I was telling them how they were asking about lamps, oil lamps, and I said, "Well, look, we have this oil lamp, and it's made and it has from Augusta Lorries. They used to make this little metal thing. You can buy them here now, and I actually bought some in Crete, and they have a little wick on them. But they used to use a little plant, which looked like a little dunce's hat. You know how some flowers have got a little green thing and the petals come out of it? Well, they used to dry this little thing, and they'd put it on, and when they lit it, it would actually form some carbon, and then it would just suck the oil up into that and burn until all the oil went. So, anyway, my grandmother used to have the thing, and I call the article My Grandmother's Lamp. And I started off the story. I thought, well, I'll make it a bit more interesting, just sit down and say, you make a lamp by taking a container this size and that size and put this much oil. So I call it My Grandmother's Lamp. And I started off the first sentence, and I said, the last time I saw my grandmother's lamp was on her coffin. Right? I'll let you have a copy of it. It's been published, and I said it was in a room where everybody sitting around was in black, and the only light in the room was the lamp, and it sort of everybody started to shiver and shudder, and so I then went on to talk about my grandmother a little bit, like how she came to Australia and some of the little stories I've told you. And then I blended that in with actually constructing the lamp. And I reconstructed the lamp. And I went to my aunties, there's a few of them still alive, and said, look, those fidelia we used to have, has anybody got a plant that's got them or growing them? And they said, no, we haven't got them, Anyway, one of my aunties says, look, I know a lady who's got a plant. There was no flowers on it, right? And then my cousin said, when my mother died, in a cupboard I found a jar of those fidelia, and I'm sure I didn't throw them away. And her mother died about 20 years ago. And anyway, sure enough, she went home, rang me, said, look, I found them, you can have them. So I had all the parts for the lamp. And then what my grandmother did, remember you still get them, the Nescafe, how it has the metal, piece of metal. Now back in the old days, that metal was a bit thicker than it is now. It wasn't such a fine. And so she'd get that and cut out a little triangle, put a hole in it, and put little bits of cork at each corner, and that would float on the oil. So I got a very thin bit of metal, I cut it up, I actually made the contraption, and I put the little thing on it, and then I lit it, worked perfectly. And then I thought, now a lamp on its own doesn't look too good, so I went down to my mother's place. My mother passed away about 2 years ago, but I haven't sold the house. The house is still down there, and all the iguanas are there, on the house. So I picked out an icon of St. George and the Dragon, and a cross that my grandmother brought out from when she came out. Must have been with mother of pearl on the cross. Looks really good. And so I got our university photographer, who do professional stuff. I said, look, I want some really good photos. And they produced the photo of the lamp, and the back is St. George and the Dragon and the cross. And when I sent the article to the journal, they said, gee, this is fantastic, so we're going to put it on the cover of the journal. So it's on the cover of the journal. So anyway, I thought that was, putting something down, in memory of my grandmother. Anyway.
It's beautiful. Yeah. Have you seen her characteristics, whatever, come up into the children?
It's interesting. My brother's one of my brother's daughters. She is about 6 foot and has some similarities to her. And my brother would say, "Oh, she's like the grandmother," but I don't think she is. I think he was stereotyping rather than because my brother was a bit more impetuous than me. Didn't have the patience that I had. I suppose a certain stubbornness my grandmother had, in that she knew what she wanted to do, has come out in my kids. But then again, Lifty's got a bit of that in her as well. So it's hard to say whether it's from her. I'm not stubborn myself. Okay, I do. I like to, get a feel of other people's opinions, and I mightn't change my mind in that sense. But I'm not sort of saying, well, that's what it is. I do like to accommodate other people.
So that was more from your father? From your mother?
Might have been from my training more than anything. In that, being a teacher and an academic, you really have to see. I always believe it, as an example, and this is very hard for my colleagues to accept. A typical thing might be, the students didn't do too well in the exams. All right, fair enough statement. You might have had 50 kids and 10 passed and the rest failed. Facts are they didn't do well in the exam. Okay. Now, when a statement is made like that, without any further clarification, it seems to me that the emphasis is that the students weren't good this year. They didn't do good at the exam. It wasn't a good bunch of students. My perspective is this, that in any situation there are three components. I've always worked on this, and it's nothing to do with the Holy Trinity or anything, but there are three components. And first of all, if you take that example, first of all, there is the student, okay. Now, if a student that doesn't do well in an exam, you could say, let's put a third of the emphasis on that student. Either the student didn't study, didn't understand what was going on, misinterpreted something, the student thing, okay? Then you say put a third onto the lecturer. The lecturer lectured on this topic and examined on something totally different. Gave the wrong question. Stuffed the question up, put an extra word in and confused everybody. Didn't do his job properly, right? The third thing is the exam itself, which includes the environment, the physical state of the student on the day. These are all factors that affect the thing, and when it comes to looking at things, I like to think a bit more broadly, about the situation. And so, and I've found through life that, say you're in a situation, if one thing goes wrong, you can usually salvage it and rejig it and everything else. But if there are two or three things go, then it's pretty hard to retrieve the situation. And so, so I suppose, if that's the opposite of being sort of stubborn, considering other options, then I'm not stubborn in that sense. You know. But I am persistent, which is different, I think, to stubbornness. You know, I mean, like for example, that like you were saying the other day, said, you know, you had that meeting last year in the middle of the year, and last week you ran the school. So in other words, you didn't stuff around. You brought these people together, said, okay, what's the situation you want to do, and we worked out what had to be done. And I didn't go back to it and say, well, look, do you want to do it? Do I want to do it? I knew I could do it. I went and did it, and gave the people something a year earlier than they would have got it if they'd done it under their own resources. And the thing is that, you know, that's what I do.
Can we stop along here so we can get another tape?
Yeah, sure.
There's plenty of power and speed on the runway, so Shirenko opens his competition. Just drag the right elbow, gets the white flag. Distance measured from the front of the board to the nearest mark in the pit. And you'll just watch the